It's Sunday night. It's 8 o'clock in the evening. It's time for the Bible Forum. I'm Warren Sprouse, your host and your guide for the next 2 hours as we look at life through a biblical lens and try to solve all the world's problems in 2 hours or less. Are you signed up to receive our weekly rundown of topics? You get a once a week email. I send it out every Saturday afternoon, give you some idea what the topics are going to be. If you'd like to get this email, just write to me at thebibleforum@gmail.com. Just say, send me the email. I'll put you on the list. You will not get email from any other source, and you will not get any other email from me unless something is going on that's really important. This has been an interesting week. It's been a week filled with all sorts of things that are worth talking about. And so we're going to talk about the social unrest that's going on in the land, about how to define racism. Are Americans racist at heart? We're going to look at a question, do Black Lives Matter? We're going to take a look at South Carolina's black senator as he responds to all of this. We're going to look at the feelings over facts. That has become our new reality. In the second segment, we're going to look at the culture. What about the culture? Tucker Carlson was on Fox this week saying some pretty provocative things, as he normally does, and he got a reaction. We're going to talk about the reaction. I'm going to ask you what you think about it. I know what my opinion is, and I'm not happy. My opinion of opinion polls has just gone up. We'll talk about that. And so much for history. In Michigan and Minneapolis and New York. What about those Confederate military base names? Want to get rid of those? In the third segment, we're going to talk about the children, about victory at the Missouri Supreme Court. How badly do you want a child? And youth programs. In the fourth segment, we'll look at reparations. Reparations for whom? And then we'll talk about the Bible. Judges 21, verse 25. What is right in my own eyes? And then we'll ask the question, has the Great Tribulation begun? I give you the answer up front, no. But some people think it's about ready to start. And last but not least, we'll look at our Sunday sermon, our evangelical heritage. But for today, we're looking at social unrest. Is there racism in the land? There is. Is it as rampant as the critics would have us believe? I don't believe that. So I ask you the question, how do you define racism? TV station KMOV in Missouri reported Kennedy Mitchum, a recent college graduate with a degree in law, politics, and society, writing an email to Merriam-Webster after arguing with others about issues related to racism. When the dictionary's definition didn't back her up, she wrote an email to the dictionary publisher demanding they change the definition. She said, with everything going on, I think it's important everyone is on the same page. She says, a couple of weeks ago, I was like, okay, this is the last argument I'm going to have about this. I know what racism is. I've experienced it time and time and time again in a lot of different ways, so enough is enough. So she said, I emailed them about how I felt, saying this needs to change. In her May 28 email, she wrote that racism is, quote, both prejudice combined with social and institutional power. It is a system of advantage based on skin color, end of quote. I basically told them, she said, they need to include that there is systematic oppression upon a group of people. It's not just, oh, I don't like somebody. It's a system of oppression for a certain group. Now me, not being black in color, I can't speak to the complaint. But I can speak to what I see. I see people of color in this country able to succeed, able to be accepted, able to do any job, participate in any profession, able to make tons of money, just like anybody else. I also see dark-skinned people living outrageously decadent and foolish lives, just as I see other people, regardless of their skin color. It's a human thing. Now, I believe there is prejudice in this country. Prejudice against people who are not like everyone else in a particular area. I have been victim of prejudice in my life. Take a New Yorker and transplant him into a seriously country culture. He's going to have trouble. He's going to have a problem integrating, a problem communicating, a problem understanding. People are going to talk about him. He'd be up against people who don't understand what he's saying, don't understand why he does what he does the way he does it, don't like some of what he does. It is called prejudice, but everybody's got one, or more. People of color who are intent on emphasizing that difference have a hard time getting along with other people. Oh, just like anybody else who's purposing to emphasize their differences, like wealthy people, or highly educated people, or movie people, gun people, country people. You don't have to be prejudiced against people of color to be a prejudiced person. It's just that people of color, well, they stand out. Look at them. Their skin is a different color. It takes time to figure out just who's the jerk and who isn't. In my world, people don't make these kinds of quick decisions about people based on superficial images or styles. The people in my world understand that human beings are more than their appearance. Often you'll learn that someone who does something, lives a certain way, does that for a reason. It may not be a good reason, but it's a reason. In business, it matters only that you get the job done in a manner that befits the company or person for whom you are working, and oh, by the way, who's paying your salary, or in other cases, customers that you serve. The color of your skin, your ability to understand quantum physics, or how you spend your money, doesn't matter. It's nobody's business. Nobody asks, nobody cares. I work for a man whose skin color is black. He's the age of my eldest grandchild, maybe a year or two older. But he's my boss. And I respect him for that, if for no other reason. I do as he wishes, if I can. When I can't, I talk to him, and I try to understand how he wants these things done so I can make his life simpler, so that he doesn't have to worry about me, but also so that he understands what the issues are that I'm up against. And we always come to a conclusion, always come to something we're both in favor of. This is the fourth boss I've had in less than 4 years. In the beginning, this boss had no idea how my job should be done. He had his own idea, but he really didn't know what I was up against. His idea was contrary to my ideas in some cases, and we had conversations about that. In the end, he's the boss. However, over time, he found that letting me do my job my way was more effective. We've never had words. I've questioned him on occasion. He's questioned me. But he's the boss. When push comes to shove, I do it his way, unless he allows me to do it otherwise. Now, the reality is, day to day, he has no idea what I'm doing. He doesn't know how I do it. except that he never has to worry about me. He has told me, I don't know how many times, I never get complaints about you. The people who are writing up the orders and trying to get me to take their people home or pick their people up, they're not unhappy with me. In the end, he trusts me. He appreciates what I do, and he yields to my opinion when he doesn't have an overriding reason to change what I'm doing. It's a symbiotic relationship with a man I have come to appreciate and admire. It's being reported that a gaggle of movie and TV stars are appearing in a video to shame you, Americans, for your racism. A collective of Hollywood stars have joined forces to take responsibility for racism against minority Americans in a new campaign that encourages others to follow suit. A public service announcement, which dropped on YouTube and social media Wednesday, entitled, quote, "I take responsibility," end of quote, features a number of familiar faces decrying police officers and vowing to end perceived systemic racism. One critic points out that they appear to be reading a script. But regardless, you have to ask, what are they talking about? How do I perceive this? Is there anything here? Do you really think Americans are racist at heart? En masse? That Americans look at dark-skinned people and they think, oh, he has dark skin, she has dark skin, so they're inferior to me. They're black, they must be dumb. They're black, they're only fit for menial jobs. Or they don't belong in my neighborhood. I don't think the average American thinks like that, unless I've never met one. I live in average America. I've lived in 3 different states, 3 different cultures, 2 of them in the South. I never got that. Now, however, somebody's responded to all of this. His name is Rob Smith, and he's black. He's a conservative commentator and author, taking all this apart, piece by piece. He wrote recently, quote, "I take responsibility for every black person in Hollywood that told you it's a good idea to humiliate yourselves in the cringy video that you made apologizing for being white. I take responsibility for that because they told you that is a good idea. Because somewhere some black person told you that this is what you needed to do to prove that you're not a racist. And this black man is saying, I take responsibility for that." He says, "It's the most humiliating thing I've ever seen on the internet, and that's saying a lot. You probably don't have any black friends or real, because if you did, you'd have known that you shouldn't humiliate yourself like that to prove that you're not racist." Now, there is probably no nation on earth, no nation in history that has done as much to eliminate color discrimination than the US of A. Billions of dollars, tens of thousands of hours of video, a steady drumbeat from liberals, including the media, and still we're racist at heart? The Merriam-Webster Dictionary defines racism as a doctrine or political program based on the assumption of race and designed to execute its principles. Another definition says a political or social system founded on racism. A third says racial prejudice or discrimination. A fourth says the belief that race is a primary determinant of human traits and capacities. And finally, that racial differences produce an inherent superiority of a particular race. But you ask me, what about the good old boys? You have a preconceived idea about them? Or what about politicians? Do you think all politicians are crooks? What about people who routinely have sex and abortions? How about the stinking rich of this world? and their privilege. The truth here is that people have preconceived ideas about all kinds of people groups. Largely those ideas are driven by the people group's behavior. If a certain sort advocates, proliferates some kind of antisocial behavior, why are we not permitted to point that out? Even in a negative way, since the majority of antisocial behaviors costs the family, costs the community, costs money, time in terms of services, and influence primarily on the young. If it's thievery, we must talk about it and do whatever we can to stop it. If it's spousal abuse, same thing goes. If it's child abuse or unsanitary living conditions or any number of countercultural and or physically debilitating behaviors, we must do something. But when it comes to sex, skin color, vulgar language, anti-American principles or values, we are being told, hands off. If you try to get involved, you're a racist pig. If you point out the problem, you're a narrow-minded hypocrite. And if you're like me, you're a religious nut. And YouTube, Facebook, Twitter will ban you from their platforms. I know, I had a video taken down because one person complained. She complained about something I did not say. I appealed to YouTube. I had a copy of the video. Never got a response. I was banned for a week. And to this day, my Facebook page is gone. The Bible Forum Facebook page disappeared. I am unable to access it. It's been several weeks now. No explanation, no recourse, no response, just gone. Racism and other antisocial concepts are destructive to a society. But so is the free access by children to visuals and discussions they're not old enough, mature enough to handle. Public America doesn't seem to care about that, which makes it more difficult to raise children and more difficult to participate in social dialogue. Oh, wait a minute. Maybe that's the point. In a speech offered in lieu of his address at the denomination's canceled annual meeting, Southern Baptist Convention President J.D. Greer, speaking of how the leadership of the denomination lacks diversity, called for members of the nation's largest Protestant denomination to declare Black Lives Matter. Southern Baptists, he says, we need to say it clearly. As a gospel issue, Black Lives Matter. Our black brothers and sisters are made in the image of God. While he used the phrase Black Lives Matter, which has become a widespread motto of civil rights since the shooting death of Trayvon Martin in Florida 8 years ago, Greer noted in his speech that he is not aligned with Black Lives Matter, the organization founded in 2013. But here's a statement that shouldn't have to be uttered. For centuries, Christians have abandoned their families, jobs, comforts in order to travel halfway around the world simply to bring the gospel, largely to people of color. All colors, all people, at great cost, financial cost, physical cost. Many missionaries have died in service to God and for these people rather than leave. That institutional racism was fomented in churches 400, 300, 200, 150 years ago, and even now in some cases, doesn't change the facts. The facts are the Bible makes no distinctions regarding people groups, period. The gospel of the Lord Jesus Christ is the message for all human beings, everywhere, always has. It is men, women, sinful, uninformed, selfish human beings who foment racism. I use the term men to indicate the species, not the gender. Where you find men and women who have been changed at the very heart by God, you don't find racism. When it appears to be present among this group, it does so ignorantly, through institutional bias established by men, women who really don't know God. I'm not saying they all are unsaved, but they are uneducated in the ways of God. Because the Bible makes no distinctions when it comes to human beings. All are made in the image of God. All are born sinners before God, in need of a Savior. All who are born again of the Spirit of God are brothers and sisters of one another. Closer, very often, than our own natural brothers and sisters. To think differently, to proclaim differently, exposes either your ignorance or your desperate spiritual condition. I'm being careful not to say you're not saved. I don't know you. But your heart is still desperately wicked, deceitful, and oriented against God. If you're looking at a person's skin color and you're making evil conversation or behavior relative to them for no reason other than their color of their skin. It's that simple. We have a U.S. Senator here in South Carolina. His name is Tim Scott. You might have heard of him. He is the only black man who is a senator in the United States currently. He has recently been thrust into the center of a national debate on policy when Majority Leader Mitch McConnell put him in charge this past Tuesday, of the caucus's response to protests over racial inequality and the use of force by law enforcement. On Wednesday, Tim Scott reacted to being criticized online for a draft proposal that included plans to study police brutality and racial profiling, but not a ban on chokeholds or no-knock warrants, both of which have been involved in high-profile killings of African Americans by police and have fueled nationwide protests. He struck back on Twitter saying, "Let me get this straight. You don't want the person who has faced racial profiling by police, been pulled over dozens of times, or been speaking out for years drafting this." He also rejected accusations of being a token, saying, "How many black Democrat senators serve in the U.S. Senate? 2 black Democrat senators serve in the U.S. Senate. Ask my Democrat colleagues what their staffs look like. I guarantee you won't like the answer." Scott is 54 years of age. He reacted quickly after the death of George Floyd 2 weeks ago when he was in police custody in Minneapolis, saying firing the officers that killed George Floyd was the right thing to do. The second, arrest them, Scott wrote on Twitter. He also used the hashtag #ICan'tBreathe, which Floyd said as he was dying, in a hallmark of protests across the United States and internationally since Floyd has been killed. Scott recently praised President Donald Trump's record on race, saying his economic policies would lead to a stronger black middle class, and lauding Trump's monumental, historic support for historically black colleges and universities. But he has at times broken with this president on race-related issues, criticizing some of the president's comments and opposing nominees for federal judgeships. Scott represents South Carolina, a state that only stopped flying the Confederate flag at the State House just 4 years ago, after a white gunman murdered 9 African Americans at a church in Charleston. Scott, who was appointed to his Senate seat in 2013 and first elected in 2014, is the first African American senator from a southern state since 1881. He's been stopped and questioned by police even during his years in the Senate. On Tuesday, Scott called for quick and decisive action. He says, I think it's important for this nation to take a very powerful stand and position that says we're listening, we're hearing, and we're reacting. A conservative on fiscal and social issues, the former businessman declined to join the Congressional Black Caucus. But Scott has worked with two caucus members, Democrat Senators Kamala Harris and Cory Booker, on legislation to make lynching a federal hate crime, which has been included in a sweeping reform bill introduced by Democrats and Scott's draft plan. Scott and Booker also were among senators who worked on a law signed by Trump that overhauled the criminal justice system. Booker, Harris, and Scott are the only black senators, reflecting the lack of diversity in Congress's 100-member upper chamber. Only 9 senators are from a racial or ethnic minority, compared with about 40% of the country as a whole and about 25% of the House of Representatives. The overwhelming majority of non-white lawmakers are Democrats. Scott has broken from most of his party over some of Trump's nominees for federal judgeships, as when he announced in 2018 that he could not vote for Thomas Farr, who was accused of legal efforts that disenfranchised African Americans. He rebuked Trump after the president failed to condemn a deadly white supremacist rally in Charlottesville, Virginia, just a couple of years ago. Scott said he was optimistic that he could find common ground between congressional Republicans, Democrats, and the White House, so police reform legislation would become law. On Wednesday of this week, Scott said about 90% of the bill's text was done, and he hoped to announce something soon. He said, I've had overall positive feedback, but that the devil's in the details, and we're going to continue working through it. Five U.S. universities made the news this week, all of them punishing professors, benefiting students, and denigrating our founders. Why? Racism. Not that all these incidents were racist, only that racism drove the decisions. UCLA removed a lecturer for questioning a proposal to give black students preferential treatment in grading. Syracuse invented evidence to find a fraternity guilty of a racial slur after an investigation cleared them. The University of Missouri is renewing their demand that a statue of Thomas Jefferson be removed from the campus. Reason? He owned slaves. A Stanford dean lovingly quoted a violent activist and convicted first-degree murderer in a memo to students. And a University of Washington student petition is demanding school officials give black students a break on their final exams, accommodating their needs and understanding their pain. The petition reads, we are already disproportionately impacted by this pandemic in terms of health care access and financial hardship. Now add state-sanctioned violence. How do you expect us to enter finals in this headspace? We can't sit back and watch as injustices unfold before our eyes. We don't have the privilege that white and non-black students have to ignore what's happening and stay at home to study for finals. Excuse me. Who removed that responsibility? We're busy fighting for our rights and for the rights of future black children and students to sit down and study, they wrote. I don't really know that. I thought it was about injustice, the kind of stuff we pass laws to stop, but that's just me. Did or do any of these demonstrating in the streets think what's happened to them would be swept under the rug? Oh, wait a minute, that's what happened in Milwaukee, a liberal city. Liberal meaning absolute law doesn't count, only feelings about things. And in Massachusetts, a monument honoring the first Northern all-volunteer black regiment for the Union Army fighting against slavery in the South during the Civil War was damaged by rioters over the weekend. The Shaw Memorial depicts the 54th Massachusetts Regiment, led by Colonel Robert Gould Shaw, standing at the edge of the Boston Common in Boston, Mass. It was amazingly enough dedicated 123 years ago on May 31st, the day it was defaced. Now, it'll take a $3 million restoration project to fix it. Do you get the irony? A monument in praise of Black Union Army volunteers to fight against slavery, vandalized by black protesters of the Civil War. You must all be public school students, public school graduates. I don't know how else to explain it. We're going to come back in a little bit and talk a little bit more about the culture. What do you think? Stay tuned.